with dealing with emergency situations, both on the track and on the road. And related to that, then safety awareness it really is a learned skill. So we're going to definitely work on that. On the street, you look at stop signs, road conditions, you look around. And so safety awareness is something you already do, but there's some specific aspects to the track which are going to be important. You look at flag stations for information, similar to looking at stoplights. You look at the road conditions for the amount of grip you might have. If it's wet, you might have less grip. And you look where the cars are around you before you make any moves or say if you're going to pass someone or let them pass. So moving on to talk more about situational awareness. Situational awareness really draws on all of your senses. Primary to this, really when starting out, is your vision. Looking ahead farther than you're normally used to is really the key and start of skilled driving. So I've got a picture here of Yuki Tsunoda, F1 driver, kind of with very intense eyes. His gaze is looking into the distance. Here he's not actually driving on track, but the intensity of vision is really something that you can learn over time to look further ahead. Also over time, you want to expand your awareness further and further out so you can see things all around you, beside you, behind you. You start to hear things and smell things, which are going to help you understand what's going on with your car and the track. Ultimately, you use all these senses to increase your situational awareness. So what I've got here is a way to take a closer look at vision. So the first point I want to make is that your hands or your steering tend to follow your eyes. So where you look, if I get my hands here, they tend to move to where you're looking to. So a common saying that we have is look where you want to go, but the question is, where do you want to go? So we're going to help you understand that. Where are you supposed to look? And so in this diagram, at the lower part of the slide, we have a road hazard, like a brick, on the right-hand side. And I've got 3 cars. The first car, they are not looking ahead. You will find that some people almost look at their hoods when they drive. So they're looking down, it's right in front of them, and at speed, it actually doesn't matter. You've already run over what's right in front of you. They're probably going to hit the hazard. The average driver kind of has a normal amount of looking ahead. They might be able to avoid the hazard, but they might see it at the last minute. A skilled driver will tilt their head up maybe just 5 degrees, just look further into the distance, be more aware of what's coming up, and avoid the hazard and plan for things accordingly. And what looking ahead does is it gives your mind time to process what's coming up and to plan the appropriate action. And I'll just say here that as I present, I think we'll kind of go through the presentation and take questions at the end. If people want to put questions in chat, that's fine. I would suggest put the slide number so we can always go back and refer to it. Okay, so next we will talk about being smooth with all of your inputs. So driver inputs from brakes, steering, changing gears, applying the throttle, and ultimately your vision too is a smooth type of thing. This is particularly important in the rain. You really want to be very smooth in the rain. So smooth inputs provide predictable vehicle response, which is what you want to stay in control of the car. What this means is that all of your inputs start very gently and incrementally and are consistent throughout the range of motion. So you want to avoid any jerky inputs. You want to be smooth. Now that doesn't mean that your inputs are slow. Sometimes, say, turning the steering wheel can be rapid, but you want to initiate it smoothly and end that turn smoothly. So it's all about being kind of gentle with the car, letting things flow. Then vision, as I was saying, if the further you look ahead, it gives the brain time to calculate where you're going, and it's really interesting. It will automatically make your driving smoother. And so if toward the end of the day you start feeling tired, might notice that your driving starts to degrade a little bit. You're not as smooth as you were. You have to force yourself to look ahead, and that will really help quite a bit. So pretty interesting how that happens. So next I want to talk about braking. Then we're going to talk about turning and then accelerating, and then get into some information about combination corners and driving in the rain. But I really want to kind of break this down and look at braking as an activity. Most of us don't think about on the street. We just get on the brakes and we stop. One thing to know is that the most braking power you have is when you're going in a straight line. So that all the tires are doing when you're on the brakes in a straight line is braking. You're not asking them to turn. So you have maximum braking in a straight line. Good to know in an emergency type situation, or when you're on the brakes hard, you don't want to be trying to turn at the same time. Braking on the track really is almost the opposite of braking on the street. On the street, say you're coming up to a stop sign or stoplight, people tend to brake fairly lightly, slow the car down, and brake a little more at the end when they finally come to a stop. On the track, it's the other way around, where you brake very hard in some cases if you're really going fast, brake hard at first. And so I've got this braking intensity in my diagram here. The large bold B's to the left integrate hard braking, and as you come into the corner, you slowly smoothly release the brakes and go to less brake intensity. So what the graphic here shows is a coming into a right-hand turn. I've got some things marked here called reference points, and we don't really use those on the street. We don't think about that, but what these are features of the track that you can use to determine where you might want to brake, where you might want to release the brakes, where you might want to turn in to the corner. You might even have a certain reference point of when you want to check a flag station, which we'll talk quite a bit about in a little bit. So here I've marked 3, 2, 1. Sometimes a track will have actual brake markers that are laid out to show you how close you are to the corner. Other times you can use something like a curb, which I have at the top of the track in the crosshatched kind of rectangle. The beginning of the curb as you approach it is marked with a 2. You might use that as a braking point or brake 10 feet before it. The end of the curb typically turns out to be a pretty good point to turn into the corner. So this is just a general concept of reference points. It's very useful. So as you come into the corner, you want to be looking far ahead. Check the flag station, make sure there's no incidents happening. Get your braking done. Pick a point to turn in, which here might be the number 1, end of the curb. Turn into the corner. And I would mention that some corners only need mild braking if it's not a very sharp corner. Some corners need no braking. But this kind of illustrates a corner where you have to brake pretty hard. Say at the end of a straight, you're going pretty fast, brake pretty hard, get it slowed down, and go ahead and turn in. All right, now I'd like to kind of then get into a turn itself, looking at the aspects of turning. And a good way to look at this is when you go through a turn, where do you want to be at the end of the turn? So to focus on what we call the track out or the exit of a turn. The goal, obviously, is to be on track. You don't want to end up in the dirt. So thinking about where you want to track out. So in this case, I've got what we call a track out curb at the very top of the diagram. And you might want to track out toward the end of the curb. As you get more advanced, you might want to track out halfway along it. It's just a reference point, but that's the general idea. What we want to do in the turn here is shown by the green line with arrows. That's what we would call the line. That's where the car will travel. The goal is to make the biggest arc, the easiest turn that you can through this corner using all of the track. That will optimize your momentum. It'll keep your speed up. If you were trying to save gas, it's actually the most efficient line. So rather than hugging the inside of the track or going on the outside, you want to use this kind of wide arc where we, in this case, at the bottom of the graphic, you're starting on the left-hand side of the track. And then when you turn into the right, you go all the way to the inside. Where you touch the inside of the track, typically there's a curb. And we call that place where you touch the inside of the track the apex. And you're probably not familiar with that term. We don't use it on the street, but it's a useful term. So do get to know it. We'll refer to that. So you hit this apex on the inside of the turn, and then you start to unwind the wheel, your steering wheel, as you're applying some gas, and you track out to the far left of the track or the top of the figure here. So you're making the widest possible turn. And the goal is to stay on track. So you want to think about the track out first. Then you want to think about, well, where do I want to apex? Where do I want to hit the inside of that turn so I can make it to track out? Turns out that that's usually about halfway through the turn. We suggest a little bit past that, what we would call a late apex. That's what I've illustrated with the yellow arrow. Then the turn in point to make it to that apex and get to track out. here is a turn-in point, might be at this end of the curb. And of course, there'll be a braking point unless it's a curve where you don't need any braking, but that's kind of unusual. So you will most likely want to brake. Next, I want to talk about what happens. So as we look at this diagram, this is kind of, it's a theoretical corner. You probably actually never drive through a corner exactly like this, but it's basically the theoretical corner. What happens if instead of being on this green line, you turned in too early? And it's something you don't want to do. So that is what we're now going to talk about, turning in too early. So the line that the car would travel is the red line. And what happens if the car turns in earlier than in the other diagram that we just had? It gets to the inside of the track, or the apex, much earlier. And so as the car starts to, or the driver unwinds the steering wheel and starts to apply throttle, the car will tend to track out much earlier than the end of the curve, than the exit curb, and will end up in the dirt, possibly hit something solid. So we want to avoid that. So we really want to avoid turning in early and apexing too early. If you find yourself in this situation, you go into a turn, all of a sudden you're running out of track, you're heading toward the edge of the track, you're not going to make the turn, realize it, get on the brakes, slow the car down, and then see if you can stay on track and slowly exit the curve. If you can't stay on the track, and this is very important, and we'll talk about it more, I think, in the classroom, if you have to go off track, you want to have your front wheels straight. That is the safest way to go off, and we can talk about that later, why that's the safest way, but go ahead and make the decision to drive off the track under your control and then gently rejoin a little later down the road. Okay, so I want to go back to vision and looking ahead. So here we've got the basic same diagram we've been using with the green line illustrating where you would probably want the car to be, with a brake point, a turn-in point at the end of the curb, an apex slightly past the middle of the corner, and tracking out at the far end of the exit curve. And the sight lines here illustrate that as you're approaching the curve, looking ahead means giving your brain the information about what's coming up as soon as you can. So once you started braking, your mind already knows you're braking, so you can actually turn your head and look toward the apex. So as you're braking and approaching your turn in, be looking into the turn already. And as you come into the turn, let's say you're about halfway into the turn, you're getting to your apex, the mind knows you're already going to make the apex, so you can stop looking in that direction and you can look far ahead to the track out. And this is really key. So as you look at that track out, and then you can look at, okay, am I going to make the curve? Do I have to get on the brakes because I turned in too early? Or can I go ahead and get on the gas? And so this looking ahead is really key. And then I've illustrated coming out of the turn, as soon as the car gets straight, you're kind of done with turning, you can go ahead and look down to the next flag station. That'll keep your eyes up and it'll let you know, are there any incidents between you? Well, actually, the incident would be after the next flag station, but can you just keep going, full speed, or do you need to slow down because there could be some type of emergency situation? Okay, now I want to go to a real world example of turning. And so this here is a overhead view of turn 2 at Sonoma Raceway. This is pretty much the first turn for you novices that haven't been here before. This is the first turn you're going to encounter as you come out of the pits. The pits where you'll be coming from are to the upper right corner of the diagram. There's actually a bridge there in that little corner. And so you'll be coming out just before that bridge. So you'll encounter this first turn here. So I'm going to look at it from this straight ahead perspective. And the next slide, I'm going to look at it in a 3D perspective because you're actually going up a hill as you come into this turn, which makes it pretty interesting. So again, I've marked, so I'll just go through the features of the corner as we come through. As you come into the corner, there is a curb, blue and white concrete curb on the side of the track that you can use as a reference point. As you come into the curb, there's a curb on the inside of the track, which we would call the apex curb. And then as you come out of the corner, there is the track out curb. Similar to the diagram I showed earlier, you want to make sure that you Well, I would suggest, particularly for novices, that as you come out of the curve, you aim for the end of the track out curve. That's going to be safe. Your car's going to be straight. It's going to be no drama. And to do that, then walking back through the corner, the apex is actually very late here. So this yellow circle, it's much more than halfway through the corner. It's about 75% of the way along this track out curve. Now, that's a lot of information, particularly for novices, to take in. I don't expect you to get all of that right now, but this will be posted online. You can go look at it later. Think about it once you drive through the corner. You can think about it some more and figure out, okay, where do I want to apex? Where do I want to exit? Let's say that that works for you. Then you walk this back to, okay, well, where would I turn in to get to this very late apex? It turns out that pretty much the end of this curve, which would be on your left as you're coming up the hill, is pretty much a perfect place to turn in, hit a late apex, and get a nice safe track out. Now, because you're coming up the hill, you don't need a lot of brakes unless you are in a very fast car and you already were coming, on straight. You might want to brake about halfway up the curve, but you generally, particularly for novices, just a little bit of brakes, get the car settled, and then go ahead and turn in. I also want to illustrate here for people that turned in too early and apexed early on this curve. You can see from the satellite view all of these tracks out in the dirt. These are people that came in too fast and turned in too early, and their exit was on the dirt. So we want to avoid that. So this is a pretty complicated turn, compared to the original diagram we showed. So now we'll look at the 3D view of this. And I do want to suggest to people, so the way I got these images, I went onto Google Maps, satellite view, went to Sonoma Raceway, zoomed in, did some screen captures, and you can do the same thing. So if you're that kind of person that really likes to study things, you can take get these screenshots of each corner and really look at them in detail. Think about how you want to take it. So I want to illustrate this 3D version here because in the lower left, as you come up the hill, so you're kind of coming out of what would be turn one, or the pit exit, you're about maybe halfway out in the middle of the track, you cross under this bridge, a little bit of braking, you turn in. At this curb, you're coming up a hill. At this point where you turn in, you cannot see this apex. You can barely see the beginning of the curb, but where you're actually going to touch it is pretty far around. You're not going to see it. And the track out is up over, there's a hill here. And so from where you're turning in, you can't see it. So the first time you go through, go slow, take a very late apex, take your time, figure out where the corner is. But as you get more familiar with it, try to not only look ahead, but actually think ahead as you're coming up the hill and visualize this hidden apex and this hidden track out. Because as you become more skilled, the people that can kind of look through the hill or visualize what's ahead are actually going to have a real advantage over other people. So a small, low-powered sports car could actually really catch, probably not pass, but can really make up time on a much faster car because they're comfortable with what we call these blind apexes. Okay, now I want to talk a bit about, well, what happens, earlier we talked about a single turn, kind of a theoretical single turn all by itself. Well, most turns aren't that way. So here we have two turns together, what we would call a combination turn. At Sonoma, down the back straight, there's S's, there's about 4 or 5 turns actually in combination. So you can expand this theory here. What we want to do in a combination turn coming from the kind of upper left of the diagram is this green line again is the line that I'm suggesting is kind of an optimal line for this level of driver that we're talking about, that instead of turning it at, say, a normal turn-in point, which could perhaps be at the end of this curbing here, to go further into the turn, what we would call deeper, turn in fairly late, and actually apex on this apex curb very late, possibly even at the very end, maybe even beyond that. And what that does is it sets you up to turn into the second corner to do kind of a normal line where you can apex at the middle of the curb and track out. And so here we're imagining that there's a straightaway down at the lower right. And the turn onto the straight really is the most important because the speed you carry through that turn going onto the straight is the speed you're going to carry all the way down the straightaway. So if you don't have an optimum setup for the turn. If your line coming in is, say, this red line, which is kind of a reproduction of what the optimal line for a single corner is. So for a single corner, you'd say turn in at the end of this curve, hit a slightly late apex just past 50% of the way, and track out. So curve by itself, that would be fine. But now because you've got this other curve, now you're in here really early, and coming through this curve here is going to be really tight, and it's going to slow you down quite a bit. So this is pretty interesting. Each combination of curves is kind of like a puzzle, and you got to figure it out. So you just go through, do it a number of times, and you figure out how it works. Another thing that's important about these combination corners is that we're going to talk about weight transfer in a bit, but kind of to give you a preview of that, as you turn in to this first turn, so you're turning to the right, the weight of the car is going to go to the outside of the car. The weight of the car is going to settle on your left. And then when in the middle of these combination corners, when you turn back to the left, the weight of the car is going to shift, and it's going to settle on the right-hand side of the car. So there is weight transfer going on in this section, kind of in the middle of the corners. And that weight transfer is something that you can manage by how quickly you turn the steering wheel, where you turn the steering wheel, if you're on the gas, if you're on the brake. And it turns out that managing that weight transfer can make a lot of difference in how well the corner goes. The point I want to make here is that when you turn the steering wheel from one corner to the next, do it smoothly so that that weight transfers in a smooth and predictable manner. Because if you were to do something very quickly and in a jerky manner, the weight will transfer the same way, and it can upset the car, and it will hurt the performance through that turn. Okay, next I want to now talk about accelerating. So we talked about braking, hard braking before the turn, talked about turning, looking ahead, turn in point, apex, track out point, combination turns. Now we want to talk about what happens when you're exiting the turn. It's kind of similar to braking, that imagine you're going into this theoretical right-hand turn, you're a little past halfway through the turn, so you're at your apex. That is the point where you can start accelerating. If you're really maximizing the turn, you're not going to be on the gas very much before the apex, unless it's a very fast turn and you're not braking much. What you want to do is feed in your throttle or gas pedal as you come out through the turn. By the time you exit the turn, at the end of the exit curb, if you're comfortable, you could be at full throttle or partial throttle, but this is at the exit of the turn when the front wheels are straight. That's where you can be on full power. And you want to, as you accelerate, so imagine you're in a turn, your hands are turned, we're at the apex. As you start to accelerate, as your foot goes down on the accelerator, your hands unwind. And it happens at the same time. So we'll talk about that more in classroom, but they're connected. So you don't want to get on the gas if you haven't started unwinding the wheel. Otherwise, you will end up spinning. Okay. So let's now talk about, I was mentioned weight transfer, so we'll talk about that a bit. We've all experienced it. So I've got a few kind of fun images here. So the motorcycle in the upper left is showing weight transfer to the front. So they probably got on the brakes really hard. And what that did is it shifted all the weight to the front of the car. What's interesting is when the weight shifts, that affects handling. So when you have more weight on the front, you actually have a lot more turning power, and that can be used to your advantage. Then we move over to the upper right. We've got this crazy Volkswagen bus doing a wheel stand. So under acceleration, weight transfers to the rear of the car. So you've got more grip in the rear. And again, that can be used to your advantage if you know how to use that. In the lower left, we've got this old, I believe that's a Citroen C2V. It's exhibiting significant weight transfer to the side. So it's in a corner and its weight is transferring. The weight is really transferring to the far outside of the car. And for you engineers in the audience here, it's actually mass transfer. Weight doesn't actually move in the car. It's really mass transfer, but we talk about it as weight transfer. And then finally, this is pretty complex. In the lower right, this VW is exhibiting diagonal weight transfer. So at this point, this car is turning, probably, and braking. So its front tire is loaded. It has a lot of weight on that outside front tire, no weight on the inside rear tire. Actually comes off the ground. And you may see tires off the ground on the track, either at the rear or sometimes in the front under acceleration. So once again, just being aware that the weight is moving around when you're giving inputs, when you're on the brakes, when you're on the gas, when you're steering, you're moving weight around. And as you become more advanced, you'll learn to use that weight transfer to your advantage. So that is kind of one of our key things. So finally, last but not least, safety awareness. As I mentioned, safety awareness is something that can be learned, and we will focus on it. The flags, which there are 9 of, and they can be displayed in a few different ways. So we'll be going over that in class. I urge you to look up track flags online before the classroom and before you come to track, and get familiar with them. Understand what they mean, how they can be used. Flags are similar to when you're driving on the street, you have stoplights. Most people, when they're driving down the street, look to see if a stoplight is green, yellow, or red. I hope all of you do. And you look every time, right? You drive down the street, you look at every single light, and you just like, can I go? Do I need to stop? Do I need to be cautious? The flags and the flag stations are the same way. So I've got a flag station in the upper right here. Say, look ahead to each flag station. They're showing a yellow flag. That is a warning flag. And you want to train yourself to look at every flag station every time you go around, just like you look at a stoplight or stop sign. Are there pedestrians or whatever when you're on the track? The flag station controls that flagger there at the top of the hill is controlling the track past the flag station. So imagine you're coming up over hill. You can't see what they can see. So essentially they're looking at your future and they're telling you, hey, there is a problem on the other side of this hill. Slow down because we don't want you involved in that problem. The flag stations, a lot of times they're this booth like we've got in the upper right. Sometimes, and at Sonoma in particular, a flagger will be down in a little opening in the wall. So particularly between turn 10 and 11, this is where this picture is taken in the lower left. So they're again showing a caution flag. So the flaggers, it's interesting, they really are watching you. They are standing there looking into the cars. And as you drive by, they're there to help you and to make sure you're safe. And if they see that you have a tire going down, if you're leaking fluid, they're actually looking into the car. They can see if your helmet strap isn't connected, they can see it hanging down. They will flag you in and say, hey, come on in. We got to talk, strap your helmet, check your car, whatever. So, they're checking you out. And so you want to pay attention to them and really be aware of where they are because they're there to help keep you safe. So, finally, we will get to a subject that is maybe important for when we're at the track, driving in the rain. We all drive in the rain, most of us probably, on the highway, local street, whatever. We all do that. Driving on the track in the rain is different than driving on the public roads because portions of the track are very slippery when they're wet. So this diagram I've got here, kind of standard corner, I have a slippery area shown in what we would call the apex area or the inside of the turn. And particularly right close to this apex curb can be very slick, like ice, like you wouldn't believe it, like ice. You can spin trying to go through here at the normal speed you would go through in the dry. The reason it's so slick is because when you have race cars, so we're on a racing surface, when you have race cars coming through these corners, they're breaking down into the corner. They're going through the corner with a lot of grip, high performance sticky tires, and then accelerating out. They end up leaving rubber that's actually kind of ground in and embedded into the pavement. So you've got this rubber coating that when it's wet, it's slippery. Additionally, as the cars go through, the force of their tires on the pavement actually smooths out the individual little stones that are in the asphalt. It burnishes or polishes them. So you've got this polished pavement that's now got rubber on top of it, and it's wet. It can be very, very slick. There are ways to drive through the apex, but that's a lot more advanced technique, and I wouldn't advise it for novice and intermediate drivers. So what we're going to want to do is drive where people don't normally drive, where there's no rubber and where the stones are not polished, and that is the outside of the turn. Normally, we don't drive on the outside turn in the dry because since no one drives there, there's dirt and dust and little balled up pieces of rubber called clag So there's actually less traction on the outside of a turn in the dry, but in the wet, that's actually where the traction is. So the technique, you want to slow down a bit in the rain, don't go full speed, probably want to brake a little earlier before a corner. The turn-in technique is much later, and you just kind of go around the edge of the corner, what we would call a rim shot or the rain line around the outside edge. And then where you start to accelerate, you want to be gentle because it's in the rain, and you're just coming out. And another point that we want to make is not only is the track slick, but any painted surface or a asphalt sealer patch, they kind of look shiny, is very slick in the wet. And that's true on a street also. So painted surfaces, or like if you're going over a bridge or a construction area where there's a big metal thing covering a hole, those surfaces are very slick. And you want to keep that in mind and drive accordingly. So the curbs on the track are typically painted. So the braking curb, the track out curb, and the apex curb are painted. So you want to stay off of those because they're very slick. If you do need to go over a painted line for some reason that's coming across the track, and this is true on the road, you want to have your wheels straight. You want to drive straight over it so there's no side loading on the car. Get over that painted line and then do your turning or braking or whatever. So I think that is we're almost through. I've got this one more slide here on safety awareness, which is exit routes. So just like when you're on the road, there's places you can pull over. On the track, there are places you can pull over if you have a problem. You run out of gas, your engine stops running for some reason, you feel sick, you're having a medical emergency. For whatever reason, if you need to come off the track, you can in certain places. And a reason you might need to use extra track is if you, say, miss your braking point. So what I've shown here this is a overhead view of Sonoma Raceway. Turn 4 in particular is a very good example. As you come up through 3 and 3A, you're coming up over a hill, it's a blind apex, you're coming downhill into 4. If you brake too late or you're going too fast and you realize, uh-oh, I am just not gonna make turn 4. Well, that's okay, because the NASCAR track goes down through this gray line called the chute. There's pavement here. And instead of trying to turn into 4 and maybe going off and hitting something, you can just turn the wheel straight, go down the chute, and slowly go down through the chute, maybe 35 miles an hour. And then right here at the end of this road, there's the flag station. So you pull up there, you look at the flagger, they'll look at you, they'll know what's going on, and they will make sure when no one's coming down the straightaway into the corner, they'll wave you back onto the track and you can go around. And if you do go off the track for any reason, you want to come into the pit area and talk to the flaggers and just let them know what happened. And they're going to check you out too. How is your mental state? So I've shown here a number of places. Turn 7, there's a big parking lot at the end of turn 7. So here's this long straightaway. So again, if you're going too fast and you're not going to make the corner, there's a ton of pavement out here. Just go out there, slow it down, stop, wait for the flagger to tell you to come back on, come back on. That's fine. And again, you can go onto satellite view of the track and zoom in, and you can actually see, like down here, turn 5, 6, there's a little road here. It's pretty narrow. You have to know it's there. But for you more advanced people, as you start going faster, you want to think about if something goes wrong in a corner and you are not going to make it, where's the safe landing? Some corners have it, where I've shown these exit arrows. Some corners don't. In particular, I would point out turn 10. As you come out of 10, there's a wall here. It doesn't leave much room for error. It's what I'd call a high consequence corner. So you don't want to push it in a high consequence corner until you're comfortable and you know how things are going. So I believe that is really the bulk of what I wanted to say. I will be at the track on Saturday and Sunday. Happy to chat with anyone, answer any questions, but like to have people's questions now. And so thank you very much. And Johnny, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to chime in. Sure, let me do that. we go. Dante, go ahead and let us know your question. You might want to unmute yourself if you're still muted. He looks unmuted. Dante, we can't hear you.
Hey, how is
okay.
it now?
Yep.
Yeah, it's a setting problem. So, question is on like the pavement on the apex point, things like that. Like last week like at Thunder Hill, like we saw like a lot of people like basically driving through it, and then I'm kind of like questioning, when and when not to drive onto the pavement.
Sure. So you're talking about the apex area of a turn?
Yeah. Like apex area, or sometimes like the turn in, you also have those pavements.
Right. No, that's a really good question, and the answer is that it really depends. So different tracks are different. Sometimes, like at Watkins Glen, there's some concrete patches in the middle of the corner in the apex area that are actually grooved, and they have a lot of grip. So you do want to be on them. So it depends. Other times we had a situation where Virginia International was repaved, and then they coated the apex area with this grippy substance so that you had a ton of grip in the apex. But when you came out of the apex onto the normal track, it had less grip. We had cars spinning off the track all the time. So the answer is, when you don't know how much grip is there, come into a turn slowly. Go through the apex if you want, or a little bit outside of it, and just see how it feels. Some turns are perfectly fine. Others are just amazingly slippery. So it really is, and it's really talk to the people at the track. So typically, I don't have a rain line view for this track here, but each track as kind of a known slip areas and good grip areas. And so talk to someone who's been to that track a number of times and say, hey, what's the rain line? Where's the grip? Where is it not? But if there's not anyone like that, you just need to experiment and figure out where the grip is. And so that's a more advanced thing, I would say for intermediate advanced drivers. For the first time people, you're not going to be going that fast. If it feels slippery, try a different part of the track to see if there's a little more grip. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot for the answer.
Okay, yeah, sure. I see a question on temperature here. If ambient temperature is going to be 50 to 60. Do you recommend all season or summer tires? For most people, I'd say, assuming you're driving the car that you drive on the street, drive your normal tires. I mean, you're probably not going to have another set of tires if that's the case, if you're a novice, because I think it's best that people drive the car they normally drive because you're familiar with it, and what you learn on the track is then going to transfer to the street. You're talking about summer tires. Oh yeah, and Johnny has a comment there. Yeah, I was driving on Sonoma with in my street car with some mud and snow tires actually on a hot day, and it was fine. I think you'll be fine when you get down to with certain R compound tires. I've had some that at around 32 degrees or 40 degrees, they were just horrible. And then I switched to another brand and they were perfectly fine. So it's really kind of tire brand dependent also. Well, and another good point about driving in the rain is avoid standing water, puddles, because if you hit a puddle with one wheel on your car, but not the other side of the car, then you have a kind of a differential in grip, and that can really upset the car. If you're going real fast and you hit a puddle with one tire, it can actually almost spin the car, or it may. So try to avoid standing water because you're really just going to hydroplane through it anyways. And I did want to reemphasize what Johnny was saying, that driving in the rain is actually a great experience. I really enjoy it. And actually, when I lived back east, I would go up north in the winter and we did ice racing on frozen lakes, which sounds crazy, but it's a super low friction environment. You learn to be really, really smooth with all your inputs. And it's similar to, as you get more experience and are carrying more speed through a corner, if you're going through a corner at high speeds, just kind of at a reasonable 7-degree slip angle or so, and you're kind of right on the edge of adhesion, the ability to be just very gentle and smooth and looking ahead is key to keeping the car on the track and having good lap times. So yeah, come on out, drive in the rain. If you got a high horsepower car, just don't step on the gas. Just light foot it, and you'll be fine. Okay, we've got a question on, is it recommended to turn off traction control while driving on the track as a novice? Why or why not? My answer to that is drive the car the way you normally drive it on the street. So if you turn the traction control off on the street, you're comfortable with that. That's what you're used to. But in general, I suggest leave the traction control on. It will save you a little bit if you make a mistake. It might keep you on track. What you want to do as a novice and intermediate driver is pay attention to the traction control. So when that little light starts to flash, ask yourself, well, why is it doing that? Because you need to understand what the computer is doing for you before you turn it off. And when you start to understand, okay, here's why my traction control is coming on, and if I turn it off, then I'm going to have to do that, whether it's lifting off the gas or turning less or whatever. You're going to need to make that correction. And so until you understand what the traction control is actually doing, leave it on. And it's really interesting. Like in some cases, in the dry in particular, I was driving a Mini one time and it just had no power coming out of the corners. So I realized the traction control's on. It just killed all the power. I turned it off and it was perfectly fine. So it's kind of car dependent. But so my suggestion, and Johnny, you can back me up if you want, is leave it on until you know what it does. And then, when you do turn it off, eventually go a little slower until you really understand the dynamics and that you're doing the work that traction control was going to do for you. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your attention. Look forward to seeing you.